The afternoon sun poured through the tall glass windows of our penthouse, turning the marble floor golden. It should have been one of the happiest days of my life. Instead, I stood frozen beside the dining table while my wife pointed at my shoes as though I were a servant she had hired for the afternoon. Clean my shoes or leave. Those 5 words changed everything. She had no idea that the men she was humiliating had just made a decision that could erase her family's entire business empire before sunset. She thought I was still the quiet husband who tolerated insults, signed papers without questions, and smiled whenever her family treated me like I was lucky to belong at their table. She was about to discover that silence had never meant weakness. Before we continue, if you believe kindness matters, second chances are real, and people should never be judged by what they appear to have, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to Heart of Hope. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories like this to you. My name is Callan Mercer, and for 6 years I had been married to Serafina Vale. To everyone outside our home, Serafina was elegant, intelligent, and graceful. Her family owned Valecrest Holdings, a massive investment and real estate corporation that had grown into one of the most powerful private companies in the country. Her father, Alistair Vale, was known for appearing on business channels, donating to charity, and shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. And then there was me. The quiet husband. The men people assumed had married into money. The men who wore simple suits, drove an ordinary car, and never talked about business at family gatherings. What nobody knew was that I had built my first company before I turned 23. I had sold it quietly, invested every dollar, and spent years building a private investment network that eventually became worth more than $15 billion. I never told Serafina. Not because I wanted to deceive her, but because when we first met, she had been different. We met on a rainy afternoon outside a small neighborhood bookstore. She had dropped a stack of books, and I had helped her pick them up. She laughed when one of the books landed in a puddle, and we spent the next hour talking inside a tiny cafe. Back then, she told me she hated people who measured others by money. She said she wanted a simple life. I believed her. During the first 2 years of our marriage, I believed I had found the person I could trust with everything. Then her family started changing her. Her mother, Octavia, constantly reminded her that she had married beneath her. Her younger brother, Rowan, laughed whenever I mentioned an investment idea. Her father rarely looked at me unless he needed a favor. At first, I ignored it. I thought love meant patience. I thought marriage meant standing beside someone even when they were going through a difficult season. So I stayed quiet. When Serafina wanted a larger apartment, I agreed. When her family needed help financing a new property project, I arranged it anonymously. When Rowan's restaurant began failing, I quietly purchased the building and allowed him to stay without knowing who owned it. I never wanted praise. I only wanted my wife to be happy. But kindness without boundaries can become permission for people to mistreat you. The morning everything changed began with a family luncheon. Serafina had invited her parents, brother, and several business associates to our home. I had been working late the previous night and came downstairs wearing a simple charcoal suit. The room went silent when I entered. Rowan looked at my shoes and laughed. Serafina followed his gaze. My shoes were old. Polished, but old. She frowned. Then she walked toward me. Callan, look at your shoes. I glanced down. They're clean. She shook her head with embarrassment. Not clean enough. Everyone was watching. I could feel my face becoming warm. I tried to smile. I can change them later. But she stepped closer. Clean my shoes or leave. The room became completely silent. I stared at her. For 6 years, I had defended her. For 6 years, I had protected her from knowing how much money I had because I wanted to know whether she loved me or the life she imagined I could provide. And now I finally had my answer. I looked at the shoes she was wearing. They were designer shoes worth more than some people's monthly salaries. Then I looked at her face. There was no affection in her eyes. Only embarrassment. That was when something inside me finally broke. I didn't shout. I didn't insult her. I simply walked upstairs. Serafina probably thought I was going to clean her shoes. Instead, I entered my private office, closed the door, and opened a secure account that I had not touched in months. The number on the screen was almost impossible to comprehend. $15 billion. $15 billion. I made one call. My chief financial officer, Mara Ellison, answered immediately. I told her to activate the emergency divestment plan. She asked if I was certain. I looked through the glass wall at the family that had spent years believing I was beneath them. Yes, I said quietly. Pull everything. Within minutes, investment positions connected to Vailcrest Holdings began disappearing. A major credit facility was withdrawn. 2 pending acquisitions were frozen. Several properties that Vailcrest had assumed were financially secure suddenly had new ownership. The money I had quietly provided over the years had never been gifts. They had been investments. And every investment had a contract. I had given them opportunities. I had never given them ownership of my future. By the time I returned downstairs, everyone was still gathered around the table. Serafina looked irritated. You took long enough. I sat down. She pointed toward her shoes again. Then her phone rang. She answered it. Her expression changed. I watched the color leave her face. Her father stood immediately. What happened? Serafina put the call on speaker. Their bank manager was speaking rapidly. The credit facility had been terminated. A property acquisition had collapsed. 3 major investors had withdrawn. Then another call came through. Then another. Within 20 minutes, Vailcrest Holdings was facing the kind of financial crisis that could destroy a company built over decades. Alistair stared at me. For the first time in 6 years, he looked at me as though he were actually seeing me. What did you do? I looked at him calmly. I stopped protecting you. Nobody spoke. Serafina slowly stood. You did this. I nodded. Her voice became smaller. Why? I looked at her. Because you finally told me what you thought I was worth. She began crying. But those tears didn't make me angry. They made me sad. Because I remembered the woman from the rainy afternoon 6 years earlier. The woman who had told me that money didn't matter. The woman I had loved. The woman who was now standing in front of me surrounded by everything money could buy, yet unable to buy back the trust she had destroyed. I could have crushed them completely. I had enough power to do it. But I didn't. Instead, I offered one final condition. I would protect the employees. I would make sure every ordinary worker received their salaries. I would keep the retirement funds intact. I would also preserve the family home. But the luxury cars, private properties, unnecessary investments, and extravagant lifestyle had to go. Their business would survive, but they would have to rebuild it honestly. Serafina looked at me through tears. Are you leaving me? I took a long breath. I already left the moment you asked me to choose between my dignity and your shoes. She lowered her head. I walked toward the door. Then I stopped. There was one thing I needed to say. Serafina, I never wanted you to bow to me. I never wanted you to know how much money I had. I wanted you to love me when you thought I had nothing. She cried harder. I did love you. Maybe you did, I said. But somewhere along the way, you started loving the life more than the person. I left that afternoon. Not with anger. Not with revenge. Just with a suitcase, an old watch, and the strange peace of someone who had finally stopped begging to be respected. The months that followed were difficult. Serafina's family had to sell almost everything unnecessary. Rowan rebuilt his restaurant from the ground up. Octavia began volunteering at a community shelter, something she had never done before. And Serafina changed the most. She started working with a charity that provided meals and school supplies to struggling families. She never asked me for money. That mattered. One afternoon, nearly a year after the luncheon, I visited the shelter anonymously. I saw Serafina carrying boxes of food. She looked tired. But she looked peaceful. She noticed me. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then she smiled sadly. I used to think losing everything meant losing my life. I said nothing. She continued. Then I realized I had spent years surrounded by everything except the things that actually mattered. I looked at her. Are you happy? She nodded. Not every day. But I'm becoming someone I can respect. That answer meant more to me than an apology. We didn't immediately reunite. Some wounds need time. Some trust has to be rebuilt slowly. But we started talking again. Not as husband and wife. Not as rich people. Not as members of powerful families. Just as two human beings who had once loved each other and were finally learning what love was supposed to mean. Months later, Serafina returned the keys to the luxury apartment. She had chosen a small home near the shelter where she worked. When I visited, there were no marble floors, no designer decorations, and no expensive furniture. There were books on the floor, plants by the window, and a small framed photograph from the rainy afternoon when we first met. She had kept it all these years. I smiled when I saw it. She looked at me and said, "I wish I had understood sooner." I replied, "Understanding late is still better than never understanding." And maybe that was the real lesson. The $15 billion had never been the most powerful thing I possessed. Money could protect me. Money could destroy an empire. Money could open doors. But it couldn't give me back the years I had lost. It couldn't erase cruel words. It couldn't force someone to love me. The greatest thing I finally gained was something money had nothing to do with. My self-respect. And sometimes, walking away isn't about punishment. Sometimes, walking away is the first act of kindness you owe yourself. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that their worth is not determined by how others treat them, and subscribe to Heart of Hope for more stories about kindness, courage, forgiveness, and second chances. And before you go, please comment, "I choose kindness," if you believe that wealth can disappear overnight, but a good heart is something no one can take away. Because in the end, the man who was ordered to clean someone else's shoes didn't lose his marriage that day. He found himself. And sometimes, finding yourself is worth more than $15 billion.
Calvin was humiliated by his wife and her wealthy family, who never knew the quiet husband they looked down on secretly controlled a $15 billion fortune. When Serafina told him to clean my shoes or leave, Calvin finally stopped protecting the family and withdrew the investments keeping their empire alive. But instead of destroying them completely, he protected their employees and gave them a chance to rebuild their lives with honesty and humility. Months later, Serafina changed, realizing that wealth had given her everything except the love, trust, and respect she had thrown away. In the end, Calvin learned that his greatest victory was not the $15 billion, it was finding his self-respect and choosing himself.